Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for joining this live stream. In this chat, I'd like to talk about rule of law and due legal process in the context of political prisoners. Now, this is a pet peeve of mine, by the way, the due legal process and the rule of law. I believe that if the rule of law is properly applied and due legal process exists, that tyranny is therefore impossible by definition, because tyrants have to push through that barrier that's there with the rule of law, that is everyone is equal under the law, and due legal process, that is an independent court assessing the facts and the evidence. So let's just look at that and see where we are today in the West, because the rule of law and due legal process just get in the way of the globalist agenda. In order to press ahead with the globalist agenda, to enforce it on an unwilling populace, and to enforce it on a white population, which is going to mean lower standards of living and few legal rights and reduction of legal rights and that sort of thing, they've really got to push past this. They can't implement their agenda and uphold the law and uphold due legal process and the rules of evidence and so on. So they have to discard this in part or indeed in totality, or just apply it so selectively that it in effect doesn't exist. And we can see examples of that. I mean, just look how Trump supporters, people that just voted for Donald Trump, free citizens, private citizens who've committed no crime, but just it's an ideological crime. You vote for Donald Trump, you are therefore an ideological enemy, and therefore they'll come after you using the apparatus of the state to go and get you. Now, there's a huge contrast in how the rule of law is applied. For example, if you take over the downtown area of a city and you say you're doing it to protest climate change, for example, that's a globalist agenda that they want. The globalists want the climate change thing. They're in full support of it. They like it. It destabilizes society. It allows for the wealth transfers they want to effect, and so on. So when protesters do that, they either don't get arrested, or if they do get arrested, they get a small fine and a slap on the wrist, and they're allowed to walk out of the courtroom, often with convictions not recorded. And I've tracked down folks who've been dragged into court 10 times, for goodness sake, and they're still allowed to walk out with no conviction recorded, not even a contempt of court or something like that. Whereas the people that for example, went into the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. in the United States, protesters there who have every right to protest as anyone else does, and had a very legitimate cause to protest. Some of those were just arbitrarily arrested without charge, or invented phony charges that haven't yet been properly tested in a court of law, and some of them have been thrown in prison, and some of them, as I understand it, are still in solitary confinement now. So the law is obviously being applied very selectively. Look at the case of Roger Stone, a Trump supporter, quite a vocal Trump supporter. He was dragged into a very politicized court, and I believe, treated abominably in terms of due legal process and the rules of evidence, and all because he was a Trump supporter. So I think that this gives you an idea as to already how far it's going, that if you vote the wrong way, you've got the wrong views or the wrong ideas, you can suffer a lot of consequences, and the state uses its power. Now, how the state does this is they give themselves a very low burden of proof. They need only allege or assert, without really any evidence, or very circumstantial evidence at best. And then you have to prove that you're innocent. And under difficult conditions, they won't allow you to call certain witnesses, that they won't allow certain evidence to be tendered. They'll frustrate your attempts to lodge your evidence. They use all sorts of devices at all sorts of levels at the prosecutor's office, in the activist courtrooms. They make sure only activist judicial officers hear the case. There's a whole range of things that the state can do to make sure that people they don't like, people who've committed no crime, by the way, just people they don't like, who have the wrong ideas, can be put in prison, or their lives made a misery by having to attend endless court appearances. And also there's a lot of tricks they use. They'll find out an address you lived at 10 years ago, and they'll send the letter for a court hearing to that address. And then they'll have the court hearing. Of course, you're not there. You never got the letter. You lived at that place 10 years ago. And then they'll have the court hearing, and you're just declared guilty in absentia. You're not there. You didn't turn up. That's your problem. Now, if you then have a problem with it, you then got to lodge a very expensive appeal and so on. So there's a whole lot of things. There's a battery of things that a hostile state can do against their innocent citizens, just because they don't like them or they want to target them or so on. Now, if they're taking on someone who's very rich, who's got armies of kick-ass lawyers, that's different. But if they're just getting an ordinary citizen, with an ordinary job, that sort of thing, then there's no way they can fight against that. They don't have the money or the resources to do it. Similarly, you can look at, say, BLM, how they're allowed to roam around spreading mayhem and violence and arson and looting and all sorts of things. And the police are ordered to stand down. There are very few arrests, and most of these guys are bailed. Most of these people are bailed on the same day and walk out. If they do have a court hearing, there's various NGOs and all sorts of things that seem to be ready to help them, give them free legal assistance and all this sort of thing. Even illegal immigrants in the United States, for example, many of those are just given free legal aid at the expense of the taxpayer, even though they've already broken laws, and the fact that they've broken laws is not even in contention. Yet still they're given free legal aid. Whereas a private citizen that wants to protest, as they did in Washington earlier this year, and they're suddenly being treated as if they're hardened gangster criminals, which is absurd. But that's how it does it. So the pattern is always the same. The copybook, the playbook is always the same and has been throughout history. That even the much vaunted Roman courts, which were given the times and the day and the relative application of the law during those times, thousands of years ago, they were an absolute model for the rest of the world, the Roman courts. But even they had that say, when the state wanted to ideologically force something on the citizenry, particularly if it's an unwilling citizenry, then what they do is they always have this same pattern. They allow or give themselves the right to target any citizen, allege that citizen committed any crime, and there's very low burden of proof. The state needs almost prove nothing. Just a vague allegation is enough. But if the citizen wants to prove their innocence, then they have to meet a very high burden of proof. They need all the ducks in the doors to line up in order to prove their innocence, and even then it may not be enough, or the courts can just arbitrarily dismiss evidence that may support the claim of the evidence of the otherwise innocent citizen. So similarly with reversing the burden of proof, instead of being innocent until proven guilty, the state, when they assert a crime, pre-assumes guilt, and it's always the same copybook. Doesn't matter where it is and how it happens or what part of the world it happens, it's always the same. And this is what we're seeing today. We're seeing it right now, not only in the United States but elsewhere. Just in Australia recently, a serial offender at climate change protests and causing all sorts of trouble. I got a $20 fine and a slap on the wrist. In fact, the judge even said that the guy was doing good work, and you're dealing with an important issue, and which is the same as things that happened, for example, in the United Kingdom, when the climate change activists are blocking your road. The police come along and say, "Was anything you like? Can we get you a cup of coffee? Do you want something to eat? It might rain soon. We'll bring you an umbrella." And it's absurd. Yet when people are protesting the lockdowns, no matter how insane the lockdowns might be, the same police officers that are crawling up the ass of the climate change activists are suddenly pulling out the truncheons and beating people on their head. These are the differences, and it's all across the Western world, in Australia, in Britain, in Canada, the United States, and elsewhere. So this is what we're dealing with here now. Now, if we all insist, and as citizens, this is one way we can stop tyranny, And think about this carefully. When we insist that the rule of law must be applied equally to all citizens, then that makes tyranny very difficult. Makes it very hard to do that, because if you're going to get this guy, then you've got to get that guy. If you're going to lock up the protester for the lockdowns, then you have to lock up the climate change guy. If you're going to beat the protester with the lockdowns, then you have to beat up the climate change. It must be applied equally. You must insist on an equal standard. Now, that makes it very hard. If they can't apply the law selectively, tyranny is very difficult to push on to a citizenry. So that's number one, and really consider this deeply, because it is vitally important. The second thing is impartial courts with due legal process. Now, if a judge or a jurist, it doesn't have to be judge, it could be a magistrate or something, is a known activist, and that they have activist views and sympathies, then we must insist that any litigant can demand that jurist is removed and an independent, impartial jurist is, ideally activist jurists shouldn't be appointed in the first place, but assuming for the moment that has happened, then that's the first thing about due legal process. It must be an independent judge who is hearing the case, and they must rely on the facts that are presented to them during the course of the case. The other thing is the due legal process. Now, what that means is that the evidence of Party A and the evidence of Party B is given equal weight, unless the evidence has been tested and one is proved to be factual and the other not. In that case, obviously, the factual evidence is accepted. But otherwise, the evidence must be given equal weight. Both parties are given equal time to review documents and to formulate a legal response. They're given equal time to cross-examine and re-examine witnesses in the witness box under oath. It can't be a situation, which is so often the case in activist courts, where they'll allow one side hours to cross-examine and re-examine, but the other side is allowed a few minutes or not at all, or the witnesses are sent home, and then and this often happens, by the way, the witnesses that one side's already cross-examined for hours, those witnesses are told, well, that's it, you can go. And then the other side said, well, if you want to bring those witnesses back, you have to pay a large bond to the court, for example. Now, that could be beyond the means of the litigant. So that means they can't cross-examine those witnesses that the other side was allowed to. The other side can do it for free, but if your side wants to do it, then you have to pay a bond. So that effectively prevents a cross-examination of the witnesses. So the jurist at the end can say, well, the only evidence I've got in front of me is that so-and-so is the bad guy and we're going to lock him up. Whereas in reality, that's not the case at all. The jurist, the judge, has actively gone out of their way to prevent any evidence that may help that litigant or support that litigant or rebut the claims of the other litigants. So these are the things so these are very important, and if they're enforced, the rule of law, due legal process, the rules of evidence, impartiality of the jurist, it is nigh impossible for the state or the government to behave in a tyrannical manner, other than just total anarchy and chaos. Courts and everything, nothing matters anymore. The police forces are running riot and that sort of thing. So that's something we need to insist on, and it'll put a huge break. It'll seriously prevent the sort of tyranny that we're already seeing in the West. The idea of the independent court and the impartial jurist. This is already something that's pretty much fallen apart. In the United States, it's probably you've got a 50% chance at best of getting an independent impartial hearing, particularly if it's ideological or political ideological. If it's who cut down the next door neighbour's roses or something, that probably will still get a fair hearing. But there's even a hint of politics or ideology or social justice and that sort of crap in it, then you've got a 1 in 2 chance of getting an independent jurist. And it's that gap. It's that gap that the the tyrannical state manages to go through, not only to divide the citizenry, but to target citizens, innocent citizens who committed no crime, to target them, silence them, imprison them, and so on. And as a subset of that, how the state has outsourced its goon squad behaviour to the private sector, particularly those organisations that are full-throated supporters of the globalisation ideology. What happens to certain people that maybe legally they can't quite get to them, then they're shut out of all social media. They're not allowed to, or they're not permitted to use any bank accounts or banking services or financial services, and so on. So their lives can be made difficult and miserable in other ways. And the means to normally it would be the Justice Department that would prosecute the banks for behaving that way, because it's outrageous and completely unacceptable. So it'd be normally those guys that would the Justice Department would do it. But if the Justice Department itself is politicised, then they won't do it. So that outsourcing there. So the means to hold these organisations to account through an impartial legal system is similarly important, and why it is so important that we protect that. Now, a lot of people don't understand this. They're fixated over freedom and legal rights and so on is having 2 transgender bathrooms in each building, or it's having 2 black lesbians as co-presidents, or so. They see it in that sense, which of course is not. It's got nothing to do with fucking freedom. So to protect from tyranny, due legal process, the rule of law, the rules of evidence, these are the big issues. Now, they're quite background issues, but once they're in place and fiercely protected, ideally by our lawmakers, but they're missing in action, then we've got the means to prevent the tyranny that we're seeing now and that is increasing by the day, in my view. That's my take on it. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.